Hey everybody, time for diversity and the delayed lecture on hate crimes. The title of this lecture is Why Do We Have Hate Crime Laws? Why is it important to have laws about hate crimes or bias crimes as they're often called? Um, and it's hot as hell up here even though I'm doing it late at night, but I'm still drinking coffee. So this lecture, remember when we cared about these people, Meghan and Harry? I bought this in London. Remember when we cared about royals? We cared about royals. Oh, copyright. Can't sing that without the copyright. All right, so here we go. So a lot of this we discussed in the Zoom, but I want to kind of go through this point by point, and there is a lecture question attached to this. So here we go. So one of the things about this, I mentioned in Zoom that the concept of hate crimes is kind of a new concept that we've always probably had. I mean, Columbus was a vicious hate criminal, but we didn't really call him that because he was representing the royal order of things. Certainly, the lynchings in the 1960s done by the Ku Klux Klan fit our definition of hate crime, but they weren't defined as hate crimes at the time. We really didn't start getting kind of this conceptualization of bias motivated criminality until the 1970s. Until the realization that the civil rights laws that were passed in the 1960s, especially 64 and 65, didn't fix racist violence. We still had racist violence. In fact, there was a backlash against the civil rights movement that really emerged in the 1970s, where we saw the revival of hate groups and a whole bunch of new ones that joined along the way. Some of the ones that we talked about, including groups like Aryan Nations and neo-Nazi groups, and of course the Ku Klux Klan. And so there was a recognition that more had to be done to stem racial violence, especially since the perception of many people, which I think was completely right, that a lot of this racial violence and religious violence and gender motivated violence was coming from agents of the state. It was coming from the cops. The town I grew up in, Stone Mountain, as I mentioned many times, is the birthplace of the modern Ku Klux Klan, and at least until the 70s and maybe beyond that, it was well known that police officers in the local police department, many were actually members of the Klan. And so if somebody was burning a cross in front of your house, you're not going to call the cops because they're already there. So there needed to be a more symbolic message that these crimes were not permissible. They were not sanctioned by the state. So we started getting this kind of discussion about the notion of a hate crime, that a crime that is motivated by hate, that is and as we'll talk about, is qualitatively different than a regular crime. And when people say, isn't every crime a hate crime? I say most crimes are motivated by money. Petty larceny is the most common crime in America. It's hard to pin a hate motivation on that. Even things like domestic violence, for the most part, are interpersonal and aren't motivated by hatred towards a category of people. Although some might be, right? Somebody who really hates women and takes it out on his wife. Can never be hot enough for coffee. But we started having this conversation in the 1970s, and we also started seeing, along with this conversation, as I've mentioned, the sort of new rise of hate groups, more insidious, more violent, and groups like the Order that were very active here in the Northwest, Posse Comitatus, a new version of the Klan, a kind of leaner, meaner version of the Klan, and some pretty serious violence, lynchings into the 1970s, places like Social Circle, Georgia, and we continue to have lynchings. If you've been following what's been happening in southern Georgia and Brunswick, there's a lot of people that have likened that to a modern day lynching. So the increase in hate group activity, the recognition that the civil rights laws of the 1960s didn't stem the wave of racial violence, and a desire to separate law enforcement and their duty to protect people from the long history of racist and bigoted biased violence coming from the police. So all these kind of went in to make a stew to create the first hate crime laws. The first one was in California in 1978. California gets sort of the first crime that separates out or looks at crimes that are motivated by, again, hate crime laws. And I always have to say this, is that you have the right to hate. Covered by the First Amendment, you have the right to hate anything and anybody. Go for it. It's protected. I'm not saying that you should, but you certainly have a constitutional protection there. You can meet about it, you can print about it, you can pray about it, you can rally about it. That is your First Amendment right. If you want to walk down the street with a swastika armband and say Hitler is my guy, again, I would ask you not to do that. But that is constitutionally protected behavior. In fact, the Supreme Court ruled in a recent case that the Ku Klux Klan can burn crosses on its own property. If you want to burn a cross, it is protected First Amendment right. You can't go on somebody else's property and burn a cross. And you can't also, and this is what the Supreme Court ruled in Virginia v. Black, that if you burn a cross, because these sort of clever Klansmen in Virginia thought they were getting around some of the laws, they had a cross burning and had a Klan rally on their property, but their property was right next to an interstate. And they burned the cross right on the edge of the property, so people driving down the highway would see this burning cross. And it was ruled that they were doing that to intimidate people, and that is not protected First Amendment. And of course, one of the things I have to say is our courts are always ruling about what is constitutional and what's not constitutional. You don't have ultimate free speech. You can't go into a movie theater and scream fire if there's no fire. Or you can't go onto a plane and say, I have a bomb, whether you have a bomb or not. You can't be like, oh, I'm joking, First Amendment protections. You can't do that. You can't threaten the president. You don't have this the absolute Second Amendment right to keep and bear arms. Arms include nuclear missiles. And people in prison are Americans. Do they have a Second Amendment right? No. So the courts are always sort of arguing. This is a whole nother discussion about how the courts enter into this. But the courts have started to uphold, especially based on a case in Wisconsin, the constitutionality of hate crime laws that looked at bias-motivated crimes for a different type of categorization of crime. And so a civil rights group called the Anti-Defamation League, and I would urge you to check out ADL.org. They have all kinds of resources around the issue of hate and hate crimes. In the 1980s, really started helping as a special interest group, helping to craft hate crime laws for states. And states, starting in the 1980s, kind of modeled after California, really started adopting these hate crime laws. Oregon got one in the early 1980s that was just updated last year, we'll talk about in a second. And they kind of spread across the country. Not all states have hate crime laws. They vary from state to state. States in the South tend not to include protections based on sexual orientation. You might guess why in the Bible Belt. Certain states like Georgia, where this murder in Brunswick happened, have zero hate crime laws. Wyoming, where Matthew Shepard was murdered, no hate crime law. Four states, including Georgia and Wyoming, don't have hate crime laws. And then we also have our federal hate crime laws that we'll talk about. It became kind of a wave in the 1980s where states started passing these laws to really recognize the violence that was happening, including some pretty brutal cases like here in Portland, Oregon, where Mulugeta Seraw was murdered in November 12th of 1988 by three skinheads in southeast Portland. And so there was a real need. The good news is that these laws are works in progress, and they continue to be amended. So about 10 years ago, I worked with the Oregon Attorney General to get disability included in the Oregon law, which it didn't include hate crimes against people with physical or mental disabilities. You know, Idaho and Washington and California, all the states around us had disability as a protection. We didn't. And in 2017, we got a new law, a new updated bias crime law that actually calls it bias crime. It wasn't called bias crime in the original law. It was called intimidation. That includes gender identity, which is a big add because we've had murders in Oregon who were people who were transgender who were murdered because they were transgender. And this crime also provides resources for people who are the victims or survivors of both bias crimes and bias incidents, things that are criminal that don't raise to the, or things that are hateful but don't rise to the level of crime. So somebody, screaming at you, go back to where you come from. Right, we've heard that a lot lately. Covered by the First Amendment, but still very hateful and very traumatizing. And I was very proud to be there at the signing of this bill last fall by our governor, and I'm a part of the task force that is implementing this law, which is a lot of work to do, but we're happy to be doing it. So the laws are sort of works in progresses, and we hope places like Georgia and Wyoming, and maybe Georgia after what happened this year in Brunswick. We'll finally get a real hate crime law. It had one, but its Supreme Court struck it down because that's Georgia. Georgia, Georgia. That old sweet song. Yeah. And then in 1990, we got a sort of our first named hate crime law on the federal level, the Hate Crime Statistics Act. And all the Hate Crime Statistics Act did is sort of define what is a hate crime, crimes that are motivated by hate, targeted at protected statuses, including race, religion, national origin, sexual orientation, and then expanded that and ask, sort of request, pretty please that police start reporting that data. And it was just voluntary, it wasn't mandatory, but starting in 1991, we started getting some preliminary data. And the good news is the FBI, this is a part of something called the Uniform Crime Report that we talk a lot about in my social problems class. The Uniform Crime Report collects the data on crime all around the country every year. It goes back to the J. Edgar Hoover days. That we've got kind of a nice national picture year by year of what hate crime looks like in America. And if you go to UCR, I'll include a link below on this video. If you go to the UCR website, the data goes back as far as 1996. So we can see, roughly there's about 7,000 hate crimes reported a year. One of the things about this number, 7,000 to 8,000, it kind of goes up and down. It was going down, and then kind of in 2016 around the Trump thing, it started going back up again. We see a couple things. One of the things are the patterns that we see. The most hate crimes are racially motivated hate crimes with black victims, followed by religiously motivated hate crimes with Jewish victims, followed by homophobic motivated hate crimes with gay male victims. Those are sort of the top three hate crimes we have in America. But the other part of this is that number is a tip of the iceberg. This is like sexual violence crimes. This is a crime that is hugely underreported. And it's underreported for reasons that you might guess, including people not trusting the police. Right? If you've got a bad relationship with the cops in Brunswick, Georgia, and you're the victim of a hate crime, you might not call the cops because you don't trust them to take it seriously. You might think they might victimize you. People fear retaliation. People fear being stigmatized. People fear maybe being outed. If I'm beaten up coming out of a gay bar, I'm from rural Oregon, and on a Saturday night I'm going to a gay bar to kind of let my hair down, and I get beat up coming out of that. Maybe I don't want the people back in the town I come from to see that story in the news. What were you doing in the gay bar, Randy? And all of a sudden, I've been outed against my will. And so there are a whole host of reasons. There's a lack of understanding. There's people who fear being deported, that if they call, and this is a huge problem in Oregon, that if they call the police to say they've been a victim of a hate crime, the ICE is going to show up with the local police, and they're on a fast plane to Tijuana. And so there are a whole host of reasons. And it's estimated based on one study that there's probably only about 1 in 15 hate crimes are reported. So when we look at that 7,000 hate crimes a year that are reported through the data from local police, it's so much greater than that, at least 15 times greater than that. There are some states that report very little. Mississippi will have 1 or 2 hate crimes reported every year in the entire state of Mississippi. Boston will have 400, but Mississippi will have 2. So we have a huge problem with the data. So anytime we talk about the official data, we've got to put a big asterisk by asterisk because it's problematic. Okay. So the question then is, and this is what I wanted to spend the bulk of this time on, is why we have these laws. And as we talked about in Zoom, we have to really use the language of terrorism, that hate crimes are acts of terrorism. They are message crimes. They are meant to send messages to large groups of people. So if you think about the 9/11 attack in 2001, which many of you were not born for, that was a crime that was perpetrated in which 3,000 people died that day. And the majority of the people were on the World Trade Center, they were on the planes, they were in the Pentagon. But the crime wasn't targeted at those individual people. Osama bin Laden didn't say, I want to kill the people in the World Trade Center. They've aggrieved me in some way. He wanted to send a message to all Americans. He wanted all Americans to be in fear. And let me tell you, as someone who lived through 9/11, we were. I mean, everybody was in a state of panic. You think, what's going on now has people freaked out. That was even more intense in its own way. And so it was an act of terrorism. It was an act against Americans. Well, hate crimes work the same way. That if I want to send a message to gay people that I don't want gay people in my society, I just find someone who looks like they might be gay, they might not be, and I beat them up as a message crime. If I don't want black people moving into my neighborhood. I find some black family that's moved into the neighborhood, and if I burn a cross in front of their house, I send a message to all people of color: you are not wanted here. And those victims were just sort of randomly selected. It's not about them as individuals, it's about what they represent. So these are terrorizing crimes, and that means we have to start a discussion about trauma. We'll have to talk about how these crimes are intended to traumatize people. And we kind of talk about the multiple levels of trauma. And there's been some really great research here. I have a book chapter coming out hopefully this year about this. But there's been some really good work entitled Hate Crimes Hurt More that look at the waves of crime. So most crimes, wave number one is on the victim themselves. Most crimes in America are property crimes. You're getting your bike stolen. You're getting your purse stolen. You're getting your heart stolen. You're having something physically taken away from you. Most crimes, even though we always talk about murder when we talk about crime, most crimes are property crimes. There's stuff getting stolen from your car gets stolen, your internet address gets stolen, whatever. Hate crimes are more likely to be violent. In fact, are more violent hate crimes than non-violent hate crimes because the best way to send a message is to hurt someone, right? So a person is more likely to end up dead, and the people who do survive, nobody wants to be a crime victim. Nobody wants to be beat up. Nobody wants to be mugged. Nobody wants to be hit with a baseball bat. But what we know is that hate crime victims, first of all, there's more grievous injury. They're more likely to end up being hospitalized. But also, their psychological impact of that crime lasts longer. They're attacked because of their religion or their sexual orientation or the color of their skin. That's not something that you change. And so if you're attacked for that, all of a sudden that feeling of being safe, you're no longer safe. That feeling of vulnerability is going to persist longer and longer and longer. And so we know these people have higher rates of depression, higher rates of suicide, higher rates of substance abuse following their attack, that people just sort of, are all of a sudden incredibly vulnerable and think, God, what world am I living in? I thought I felt safe in this world, and now there are people who want to murder me because of my sexual orientation. And I recognize this conversation itself can be traumatizing, and I apologize for that, but we have to sort of deal with these issues to get in front of them. So number one is just think about throwing a rock into a pond. It's a bigger rock, and it makes a bigger splash. And the first big splash that it makes on is the people that are the victims. They are hurt physically and psychologically to a greater degree. But it's not just them, since these crimes are kind of crimes of opportunity and are trying to send a message. It's not just the individual, because they are just sort of a convenient target, just like the people in the World Trade Center on 9/11. The members of that category that they were attacked at. So let's say you have a racist attack. People who are members of that ethnic group are also going to feel trauma. They're going to think, who's next? They don't want us here. I mean, this is the thing that happened after the Mulugeta Saral murder, is that the Ethiopian community all of a sudden was in a panic. There was a lot more stress. There was a lot more fear. People changed their patterns of behavior. Some people, stayed inside and disengaged from the community. Other people thought, maybe I should buy a gun. Some people thought, don't come to our town because it's violent. I had a Ethiopian student in my class at Portland State who told me when we were talking about the Mulugeta Saral murder that her mother was pregnant with her when this crime happened in 1988 and almost lost the baby because there was so much stress in the community. This woman almost wasn't born because something that happened to another Ethiopian person. So that community has trauma. And then other marginalized and minority communities also experience trauma, because if they're going after the Ethiopians, who's to say they're not going to go after the Mexicans, or to go after the African Americans, or to go after the gay kids, or who is next? So there's another ripple of that big rock that was thrown in the pond, and the fear level goes up, and patterns change, and people stop engaging in their community, and people kind of stay in. They change the clothes that they're wearing. They might just sort of try to fly a flag to say, hey, I'm okay, I'm with you. I mean, there was a lot, we saw this a lot after 9/11 when there was an 800% increase in hate crimes against Muslims and Arab Americans. And Arab and Muslim Americans were forced to sort of say, I'm going to be a proud Muslim and wear my hijab or go to my mosque, or I'm going to just try to hide so I don't get murdered or so my kids don't get beat up. I mean, there is real lived trauma that goes through these communities. And then the larger community is also affected. We've seen this over and over again, is that communities sort of turn on each other. Who can I trust? Who's on the side of the attacker and who's on the side of the victim? I mean, we really, and we're going to talk about this at the end. There are some strategies to sort of rebuild and build capacity and resistance and resilience in communities to be able to withstand this type. But communities can be ripped apart. And then on a larger level, the places where these crimes happen can be stigmatized. Places like Laramie, Wyoming, and Jasper, Texas, and Portland, Oregon are associated with these horrible crimes that have happened, and they become stigmatized. And so there are waves and waves of trauma that go out, but not just out over space and over different demographic groups. It also goes over time. It lasts over time, where people carry this trauma, as we've been talking about, with them. And so, as I mentioned, when we had the 2017 Max attack, Jeremy Christian was an avowed white supremacist, and still is to this day. When that crime happened, members of various minority communities, even though it was 3 white men who were stabbed, experienced heightened levels of anxiety. There were people of color told me, I will never get on a Max train again. If there are these neo-Nazis on the trains wanting to harass and kill people, I will find another way to get to work. And so it's not just over space, but it's over time. So this is sort of a short version about why we have these laws, because they create greater trauma. All crimes are traumatic. Having your car stolen sucks. This is sort of much wider and much deeper, and reflects the inability of our society to manage diversity and understand why we are a culture that embraces the differences. And we've talked about sort of why these things happen, right? In our last video a little bit, and all that anomie stuff. So the idea of these crimes is basically what we call penalty enhancement. We are going to send a message that if you commit a crime and it's motivated by hate, if you're going to commit a crime, you're going to get punished, right? If you commit a crime and it's motivated by hate, we're going to punish you at a greater level. We're going to go to the sentencing grid and throw a few more years onto your sentence. Or as I mentioned in the Zoom chat, if you have something like vandalism, which is a misdemeanor, and usually you get community service, if it's a hate-motivated vandalism, you're spray painting swastikas on synagogues, that's a felony now, and you're going to prison. You might be going to federal prison. And so the idea is, do not do this, because we're going to punish you at a greater level. And that's the hope. It's largely symbolic. It assumes that people are acting rationally and aren't going to commit the crime because they don't want to do the time, right? I mean, that's the kind of thought of all these types of penalty enhancements. The question then is that the best way of responding to it? It's not the best. It's just to send them away from it, get them off the streets longer. Because what my work has been focused on in the last few years is how this stuff is alive and well in the prisons of America. In fact, the fastest growing hate groups and the most vibrant are prison hate groups. And 95% of the people who go to prison are released back into the community at some point. And some of those people go in, lower level hate offenders, and they come out vicious white supremacists with marching orders to kill people that they hate. And we've got examples of that. The Jasper, Texas case was a very famous example of that. We've got a case or two here in Portland of members of the European Kindred who've killed minorities who may have been doing that out of loyalty to their white supremacist prison gang. So there might be other ways of dealing with this, including this concept of restorative justice. What if you were to work on the issue of hate instead of sending them to prison, where they become more committed hate offenders, where they become covered in tattoos of swastikas? Why not work on appealing to their emotional side, their empathy side, allow them to work with victims and avoid prison and actually maybe come out of the world of hate? Because so many of these people, as we talked about with regards to the group Life After Hate, tons of these people have left the movement and are now on the other side. So I worked on a case in Eugene, a federal case, where these skinheads who are part of a group called Volksfront terrorized a Jewish synagogue there, threw rocks through the window with swastikas spray painted on the rocks. And the ringleader went to federal prison, but his younger brother was kind of dragged along, wasn't a diehard believer. And the Jewish community there said, hey, why don't you give us some time with this kid? Instead of sending him to prison, why don't you let him hang out with us? And we'll introduce him to a Holocaust survivor. He can have dinner at the rabbi's house and get to know this community instead of, the people he's supposed to hate. Let's reach out to him with love. And I testified in the sentencing of that case. And I said, yeah, if you send this kid to a federal prison, he's going to become a serious white supremacist hate monger. He will come out a serious white supremacist hate monger. Maybe you should let him hang with the Jewish community and see, and this judge who was known as a hanging judge is like, yeah, you know what? I usually just want to lock him up, but I'm going to take a chance on this guy and this notion of restorative justice and see if you guys can find true justice instead of just punishing him, the punitive model. We're going to find some restorative model. And it worked fairly well. I mean, that kid has not, as far as I can tell, even though he's still sort of on the edge of the world of white supremacy, has not committed any more offenses and has a relationship with the community that he targeted. And that may be a greater justice than just pure penalty enhancement. So I just throw that out there as a thought idea. But the main message here is about the trauma, about the greater levels of trauma. So when everybody says, isn't every crime a hate crime? Say no. No, 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 no. These crimes are acts of terrorism, and they're meant to traumatize large numbers of people, and they're pretty good at doing that. Okay, that's the little click. Right on. All right, more stuff coming.